Covid-19, Environmentalism, and Racism. What three discourses tell us about our age? What do the Covid-19, environmentalism, and racism have to do with each other today? Nothing? Not quite. In previous discussions, I have highlighted the divide between two discourses, a dominant one of fear of violent death, and a heterodox one of desire for the good. The currently world-dominant discourse has grounded not merely the decision to implement national quarantines across the globe, but also the manner in which data concerning the COVID-19 was gathered, selected, and interpreted in concert across national borders. For specifics, I invite the listener to revisit my earlier discussions. At present, I shall note that two parallel discourses have been dominating our times, namely that of environmentalism and that of racism. The first invites us to care for the earth. The invitation reads as a euphemism for caring above all for our health, more precisely, for our survival. What our times are primarily concerned with is no longer life or what makes us specifically human, but survival, or what we have in common with beasts, not to speak of plants. Most people and the representative mass media are not guided by love of virtue, but by attachment to the body. Indeed, the dominant discourse seems both blind and deaf to questions of principle, questions of permanent significance, while viewing as relevant only physical appearances and data collected to define them. When it comes to justifying policies, appeals are not to the common good, but to public safety, quantity, not quality. Religious salvation, care for eternal things, is secularized in terms of escape from death, especially violent death. Anxiety in the face of the future. Now, this applies both to the COVID-19 dominant discourse and to the environmentalist discourse. Both discourses are grounded in physicalist concerns or fearful attachment to the body. What counts in both cases is not who we are, but what empowers us, what allows us to survive, no matter who we may be. This is where the racism card comes into play, since mass-mediated outrage against racism is based on a fundamentally racist reading of human beings defined primarily by physical characteristics, and thereby considered incapable of rising altogether above race distinctions. The rise of identity politics is relevant. That of Antifa movements is too. What is revindicated there is not our common humanity, but our racial identities. Why? Perhaps in order to affirm racial equality, or the fact that race has no moral significance. This aim, however, would seem to be best served by an appeal to a common humanity above any and all racial difference. Yet, again, our common humanity is not invoked. Racial identities are. These are to be defended above all against an oppressing race, namely the so-called white race. What can be done to correct the white race of its hubris, of its belief in being superior to other races, of its habit of carrying out that belief into oppressive behavior, well, all white privilege must be revoked, presumably not so that any other race privilege may replace it, but so that racial equality may be established. Racial equality seems to be identified, if not with the common good itself, at least with a primary condition for serving the common good. But then, why are the enemies of white privilege not appealing to our common good as providing the best light to dispel the darkness of racism? Perhaps because it is assumed that we can know only our means and not our end. We never meet a human being simpliciter, but only a racially charged being. A black, a white, a yellow, a red, take a pick. As moderns, we are tough when it comes to fighting for rights and freedom, but very weak when it comes to fighting for the meaning or content of rights and freedom. As if the quest for freedom presupposed the abdication of the quest for the meaning or proper end of freedom. As a result of our weakness, we often wind up fighting for words, to wit, the word freedom, mistaken for things themselves, masks, mistaken for proper ends. Does the modern, unprecedented struggle for freedom mask modernity's abandoning of the ground and proper end of freedom? Could such a betrayal of meaning be inherent in today's race wars, including the one waged by the Black Lives Matter movement? Let us consider the appeal to racial equality. Does racial equality mean race-blind justice? If so, should the formal target of public discourse not shift from race to race-blind justice? Would this be too naive a strategy? Why are we continuously driven in one way or another to focus on race? Are we to fight racism on the field by smothering racial differences in the name of racial equality? But how can we efface racial differences without promoting racial mixing or racial melting pot reminiscent of other melting pots, not least of them the religious? How else could racial equality be concretely established? Yet, what guarantees that racial mixture will foster racial equality or the disappearance of racial prejudice? What assures us that new racial distinctions will not be created in the aftermath of racial homogenizing? After all, even racial discrimination is based on a modern invention or artifice, namely the modern anthropological notion of race. Perhaps then, the goal is not merely racial equality, but equality tout court. Not merely equality under the law, but natural equality. Equality not merely of rewards, but of capacities. Perhaps race discourse is a mere Trojan horse in the context of a larger battle for equality as an end in itself, or at least as the best means to achieve the common good. Is the war against racism today instrumental to the consolidation of a radical egalitarian ideology? When calling for racial equality, perhaps supposing that the so-called white race should be mixed with others, lest some claim it to be purer than all mixed ones, are we inviting the abandoning of all modes of superiority? Is the white race culprit here serving as pretext for our rejecting not merely race theory or the belief that physical traits have moral connotations, but any natural moral hierarchy, which is to say, the very notion that moral worth is inherent or immanent, as opposed to being conventionally granted or accredited, most likely on the basis of appearances. After all, the critique and rejection of a natural moral hierarchy remains at the blistering heart of much of contemporary jurisprudence. Legal theory has by and large abandoned the classical, non-metaphorical notion of natural right, or of the original inherence of right in human life and customs. The difficulty we find in thinking natural right today depends in no small measure upon our specific upbringing. We are strategically and continuously bombarded by outer forms and a discourse revolving around them. Both are distractions from inner forms or spiritual realities, real problems. We tend to be distracted away from real problems towards their shadows, fake problems. This happens systematically in the name of power and empowerment. The focus on outer forms, quantifiable appearances or first impressions, suggests that we are in reality power-lusting beasts rather than truth-loving men. We hear that men crave power by nature, against Aristotle's definition of the human being as naturally desiring to see the inner form of things, to return to and behold what is behind power, its source, rather than following power as such. For power, as freedom, is always after a content, without which power would remain utterly stultified. The race issue is drawn to the center of public attention precisely where it is mistaken as sign of a natural moral hierarchy, a hierarchy that would be nonsensical on a strictly physicalist basis. Race, of course, does not signal moral distinctions, yet the discourse of race, seeking to homogenize races, unfolds in the shadow of a contemporary eclipse, if not abolition, of moral distinctions, transcending those defined by our societies, that is, quantified by our institutions. Race serves, in other words, as a pretext to fight civilization, or a mode of life transcending the moral strictures or blinders of both barbarism, of both. Race serves, in other words, as a pretext to fight civilization, or a mode of life transcending the moral strictures or blinders of both tribalism and empire. For civilization stands or falls on the question of right above might. Otherwise, civilization would be nothing better than an imperialistic mask or reification of tribal barbarism. To defend civilization is to rise above the pettiness of racial differences, without trying to obliterate them, insofar as civilization is not supposed to replace nature. The lover of civilization is bent upon educating people, no matter what their race may be. Educating means elevating to what counts the most, to what is inherently most important, which is definitely not our bodies. The honest educator is blind to looks, just as his God is. Racial diversity is absolutely compatible with the flourishing of civilization. The manipulation of races for the sake of overcoming their differences is not. Of course, if we were nothing but bodies, or things evolving from bodies, then our physical and natural differences would have to be eliminated for the sake of establishing equality under the law. But equality under the law is entirely compatible with natural, racial, and sexual differences, where our equality is a purely spiritual or intellectual problem. Under the law, we would then be all equal as moral agents, and thus equally responsible, independently of physical circumstances or accidents, factors tied to our body. Legal equality, equality of both duties and rights, makes sense where our freedom is not ultimately bound to the body. If we cannot be all equally free independently of physical distinctions, then these distinctions become an enemy to be overcome in the name of freedom. No sooner are we defined physically than our freedom requires that we overcome physical distinctions. Racial discrimination becomes a bad thing as opposed to an innocent discerning only to the extent that we abandon the vision of a commonality above the law, namely our common nature as people. No sooner will we have turned our gaze to our common good than our unavoidable social differences will appear to us as insignificant or irrelevant to our cause as human beings. We could then stop fighting over race and begin fighting over what race wars tend to distract us from, namely, our own failure to face our proper ends as human beings, moral and intellectual excellence. Confronted with the objection that our race wars are fair means to establish our excellence over its detractors, perhaps even to establish a universal kingdom of freedom over that of material necessity, we can retort that genuine human excellence entails the effort to turn and ascend from the future survival of the body back to the eternity of spiritual matters. If in pre-modernity the future was a mere metaphor for eternity, let us recall, for instance, Plato's lesson on time as image of eternity. In our modern world, the future becomes a mere distraction from eternity. Whence the radical incompatibility between modern messianism and its pre-modern prototype. The divinity modern man submits to, most notably when seeking refuge from existential uncertainties, is not one with whom we can discuss and reason about the meaning of life. The God modern man reverts to is not a God of restoration, but one of innovation, the God of a future predicated upon the abandoning of eternity. A God of building, then, rather than of unearthing, so to speak. A God bestowing his blessings on technology, as opposed to classical poetry, with the understanding that, given its historically unprecedented development, unlike Caesars of old, our technology, as expression of love of power, is unlikely to ever help us return to love of the truth about and above all power. Now, as a result of our conversion from pre-modern messianism to modern messianism, we find ourselves today incapable of discerning a fundamental harmony between political religious endeavors and purely philosophical ones. Pure reason, in other words, ceases to be looked upon as proper mediator between politics and religion, between this world and the beyond. If we are to free ourselves from the ideological underpinnings of our three contemporary discourses, those capitalizing respectively on viruses, our environment, and races, it behooves us to call into radical question modern messianism or progressivism, lest we end up submitting to an oppressive confusion between politics and religion, between what we ought to do and the point of it all.